Hey everyone, we are here for our next talk. We have Mona, who is the co-founder of the Melon Protocol and the CEO of Avantgarde Finance. Before this, she was at Goldman Sachs. So she'll be doing a talk on Melon V2, lessons from Tetris, and I'll let her take it from here.
Hi guys, thanks Sanju for the intro. So today I'm gonna talk a little bit about our upcoming version 2 as we are in the lead up to it. But before getting there, I just wanted to talk a little bit about the title I chose and give some context about why I chose to link it to Tetris. So most of you will know Tetris as a game that incentivizes you to put pieces of a puzzle together nicely. I personally was obsessed with it growing up. But the part that I really like about Tetris when using it as an analogy to Melon is that it also, every time you add technically a layer of complexity or you fill a line, you also remove a layer of complexity. And I think ultimately when we set out to build Melon in 2016, the vision was ultimately to remove a ton of complexity from the asset management space. But we still want it to be a very high functioning and high performing protocol. So that's why I kind of like using this as an analogy when talking about the protocol. So what I want to talk about today is how well did we live up to that vision with our version 1, which was released in February 2019. And what lessons did we learn from V1 that we can now apply to V2, or that we maybe have applied to V2. So before we begin, though, maybe just a quick few words for those of you who may be new to Melon or who have always wondered what Melon is. Melon is a completely decentralized asset management protocol. It was the first decentralized protocol in asset management to hit the mainnet. And it's a protocol that is designed to help managers, in particular small to medium-sized managers, set up and customize a blockchain-based fund. So you can basically predefine your parameters, what management fee do you want to charge, what performance fee do you want to charge, which DEXs do you want to be integrated with, what risk management profiles do you want to have, which rule sets do you want to have, which investors do you want to be able to allow into your fund. All of that is predefined by the protocol. So you just select your preferences, and then you deploy those preferences as a fund to the blockchain. The blockchain fund has its own unique token, and investors can then access that fund. So the goal is really to lower barriers to entry for managers, basically by automating the entire administrative and operational process. We kind of, the protocol takes care of calculating the NAV, the share price of the fund each day, and publishing it on chain. It takes care of the management performance fee calculations and distributions. It takes care of enforcing any risk management parameters, and it takes care of natively integrating with other DeFi protocols. And this is really great for small to medium-sized managers because previously the barriers to entry were very high, and it's very hard to create your own track record in the traditional asset management industry because of that. It also benefits investors because investors typically don't get easy access to interesting and exciting asset management projects. So we also lower the barrier there, but we also give investors complete transparency, complete ability to verify a manager's track record, and also ability to know with some degree of certainty that if a manager says his or her risk profile is XYZ, and that is embedded in the smart contract, then basically that is actually the risk profile, and the blockchain will enforce those rules. So essentially, the problem we're solving is traditional asset management is costly, complicated, and draining. Investment managers have no easy way to scale their investing strengths and to interact with potential investors. And the solution is that Melon aims to be a cheap, simple, and empowering solution So Melon basically aims to remove all the friction, allowing investment managers and their investors to focus purely on sourcing the best investment opportunities. So that was the goal, that was the vision. How well did we achieve this with version 1? So as I mentioned, we launched V1, well, when I say we, I mean Melonport launched V1 of the protocol in February 2019. And we also became, I think, the first DeFi protocol in history to decentralize our governance back then. So Melonport was wound down. And essentially, we basically had close to 0 users in the first year of the protocol's existence. And yeah, this was, I guess a big shock to us. We'd been working pretty hard for the past couple of years on creating this. And so we were a little bit shocked by that. And I think it caused us to kind of look back and assess how well did we actually achieve what we set out to achieve. And I think there's probably 2 ways to look at it. So the first is how does V1 live up to asset management in the traditional world? And I think, we definitely hit some big milestones. In the traditional asset management space, it takes several months to set up a fund. It takes about $100,000 of fees to set up a fund. It probably takes an additional 75 grand a year to maintain that fund. And so with Melon V1, you can now set up a fund in around 15 minutes. You can do that, or you could do that for around $40 worth of gas. And you could, your kind of maintenance costs, as long as you weren't like a high frequency trader, were pretty reasonable in comparison. But in terms of the actual stats, like we weren't seeing any users at all. So we obviously weren't hitting all our targets, but we were starting to see signs of big improvements, and I guess you could have called it a proof of concept back then. So what did we learn from V1, from speaking to our community, from speaking to our users, and from analyzing kind of our past work? Well, the first big lesson for us, I think, was that having a fragmented and isolated workflow between front end, back end, and kind of biz dev parts of the team was a bit of a negative. There was no way to really synchronize the work that was happening, in a way that we were getting what we needed in the smart contracts to generate the best user experience possible. And that was a pretty big lesson for us. The second lesson was quite a big one as well. The way that version 1 of the protocol was architected was extremely rigid, and I think that one of the reasons for that was when we first set out to build Melon in 2016, and we had a 2-year roadmap in front of us. We were DeFi. There wasn't much DeFi around back then. There was Maker, there was Melon, there was Augur, and I think there was a DEX, like a very simple version of a DEX. And so, we didn't kind of back then envisage the big explosion, or maybe we did, but we weren't like kind of building Melon architecturally to get ready for such a big explosion in DeFi, including things like borrowing and lending protocols, derivatives, synthetic products, etc., farming. And so we had this 2-year roadmap, which was like basically be able to set up a fund, management performance fees, risk management rules, and integrate with DEXs. And whilst we were implementing this, head down implementing this, all this other stuff was happening in DeFi. And our architecture wasn't flexible and extensible enough to deal with this, but we were already kind of on our way to delivering V1. So lesson learned was, I guess 2 lessons, maybe not setting roadmaps in stone, but remaining kind of flexible there where possible. But secondly, building things always with an extensible and abstract framework in mind to be able to deal and handle with all sorts of other infrastructural integrations and product integrations. The third lesson that we learned is that without fund upgradability, most users were on the sidelines. And fund upgradability is an interesting one because basically the way that it has worked until now, every time we had a version release, managers would be able to set up a fund, attract their investors, and then if we had, let's say, a following release, managers would have to shut down that fund, investors would have to redeem from that fund, and then managers have to redeploy the fund on the new release to access the new features, and investors would have to reinvest in that fund. And so most managers were like, well, Melon's really cool, it looks really interesting, but we're just going to wait until you have upgradability because otherwise that creates like a huge nightmare for us in terms of managing, investors in and out, and also shutting down and upgrading funds, etc. So we hadn't realized what a big deal that would be until we, kind of started speaking to users in detail about what was holding them back. And yeah, we probably should have been more aware of that sooner. The fourth lesson we learned was that we weren't really well equipped for the extremely high gas fees that hit the Ethereum network this year. Our promise had always been that you could set up a fund for $40. I think that was in our documentation until recently. And you could, and that kind of was quite an impressive, I think, target or number to be able to market. But at the peak of gas fees in July, August, setting up a fund reached $3,000 to deploy a fund to the mainnet. And that was kind of quite shocking. We still had people setting up funds, but obviously at that point it did start to slow down. And to kind of further aggravate that, also investing in a fund was becoming a lot more expensive. I think it was $100 at the peak to invest in a fund. And trading was very expensive. So our contracts were not designed for such a high spike in gas fees. And we were probably, together with most of other DeFi, to be fair, not prepared for that. The last lesson we learned from V1 was that the user interface was non-intuitive. And I think this one also came as a bit of a shock to us, especially with our improvements in March that we rolled out at an interface level. But even after the March release, users were complaining about not being able to easily find out how to invest in a fund. People were unclear, how to find a fund that they were interested in investing in. And it was funny because all of these things were really obvious to us. But then again, we spend day in, day out, like kind of, working on the protocol 24/7. So of course we know how it works. But it was kind of quite enlightening to see all of these questions popping up and realizing that, what we had thought was a big user interface experience to most users was an incremental experience, but still nowhere close to good enough. So those were 5 lessons, I guess, from V1 that I wanted to touch on today. And now I wanted to kind of spend a bit of time talking about how we've taken those lessons and applied them to a more improved V2. So the first thing we have addressed now is having a much more integrated workflow by having basically the entire team working together with a very open line of communication. We are now able to identify UX issues immediately and then make the contractual changes that help lead to better user experience on the spot, just because there's a much flatter structure and much more open line of communication. There isn't any centralized point of communication. So that's been really great, and hopefully the the results of that will show in the new user experience. The second change that we made based on the rigid architecture that we had was re-architecting V2 pretty much from scratch. I don't think it's an exaggeration to say that version 2 of Melon has probably been rebuilt from scratch, from the ground up. As a result, it's much more extensible, it's much more abstracted, and we're now able to cope with things that we were not able to cope with before, such as integrations across all types of DeFi, both at an infrastructural level and a product level. And we're also able to handle derivatives, which previously we were not. So that is another plus for the V2. The third lesson that we applied was the need to bring upgradability to our users before making any other release. And so some of you might remember earlier this year, we were talking about a release in summer and then another release at the end of the year. And actually, we decided that upgradability needed to be in the next release. And so we decided to prolong a release and make a bigger release at the end of the year in order to be able to incorporate upgradability. And so now, because of the more flexible and abstracted infrastructure that we have, we were able to integrate upgradability patterns for the funds, and V2 will incorporate that. So we're really happy about that. And then fourth, on the gas side of things, we took note that this could be, the situation for some time. It could get worse. So what we were really good at, I think, in the last few months was ruthlessly challenging the need for every single contract. And I mean, when I say that, I really mean it. I think we probably revisited, all the code from scratch time and time and again, and just scratched large parts of it by re-questioning every single time whether something absolutely needed to be there and whether it was absolutely necessary for it to be in the smart contract. So the result now is a much lighter protocol and a much less heavily consuming of gas. Just to give an indication of what that looks like, our early testing shows, and obviously this is not a final number, but early testing shows that deploying a fund to the mainnet on V2 will require about 1/40th of the gas required on V1. So we're really happy about that too. And last but not least, I think many of you will be happy to hear that for the first time in our history, we have been conducting official user interviews and worked with a senior UX UI professional who will help us and has helped us redesign the interface and make it a lot more accessible to our users, hopefully, and intuitive. So yeah, that's a summary of the lessons we learned from V2, how we've applied those lessons to make improvement, and maybe we'll just finish on what's next in terms of kind of upcoming features for V2. I see a typo here, sorry about that. But yeah, for V2, we're just a few features that I wanted to highlight. We'll be expecting a much larger asset universe, which has been a really, really high request from our users. Will be integrated with lending protocols natively. Funds will have the ability to deposit into AMM pools. As we touched on earlier, funds will also be upgradable. We will, currently all funds on V1 are denominated in ETH, but from V2 onwards, funds will be denominated in other currencies as well. That will be the choice of the fund manager. Obviously, much lower gas fees and faster performance as a result partially of that and the new architecture, and aggregated liquidity. So on V1, the DEX liquidity was all fragmented. You had to pick one DEX to trade with, and we will have aggregated a DEX aggregator included in the new release. In terms of timeline, we're aiming to take this to audit starting on November 8th. We expect that cycle to be, it's always hard to estimate, but, kind of expecting based on past experience, 6 to 8 weeks. If that, in parallel to that, in mid-November, we're going to be launching a private testnet beta. So if you're interested in participating, we do have a few slots left. And if all goes well, then in December, we're still planning to do our mainnet release in Q4, as we promised, barring any hiccups that may arise. I think I'll just take one opportunity while I have it. I'm taking those opportunities wherever I get them to let everyone know that some of you may have seen this on social media, but also we have been under, our community has been under a bit of pressure recently to rebrand the Melon protocol from BNY Melon, who are claiming trademark infringement. The community and the DAO have decided we do not want to fight that because it's a drain on our resources, time and energy. So we will be rebranding the protocol. So I just want to highlight that now so that people are not taken off guard. So watch out for that. And yeah, and if anyone wants to keep in touch, I think we're very active on Twitter, me personally, or the Melon protocol and the whole ecosystem around it, or Avant-Garde Finance, which is the lead developer of the Melon protocol and my latest company. So yeah, I think I'm going to stop there. I don't know if anyone has any questions. I'm happy to take a couple if there's still time.
So I think there's one question in the Ask a Question section.
Oh yeah, let me pull that up. So the question is it possible to use flash loans or buy liquidations with a Melon fund? So for V2, we have integrated with Compound, so it will be possible to mint C tokens, and also we will be integrated natively with Chai. We have not included flash loans in the V2 release. However, the big kind of bottleneck towards DeFi integrations was really the architecture. And so now that the architecture has been redone, we expect our release cycles to be massively reduced from this point on, and therefore integrations, DeFi integrations should be able to occur much faster. So they won't be possible for the Q4 release, but we're hoping that it will be possible quite soon afterwards. I think there's another question. Will there be a fork? How will you rebrand into Tetris? Okay, so I mean, Tetris is not the new brand, actually. It's just an analogy that I used for this presentation. The new brand is being discussed right now. There will be no fork, at least, we don't plan to fork. We don't need to fork the protocol. It would just be a name change as far as we're concerned. So what you now know as the Melon protocol will be known as something else in a month, but it will still be the same token. It will still be the same code. It will still be the same teams, etc., the same ecosystem, but it's just going to have to change name. I think we have another question. Did you at any point consider moving to another layer one? Also, are Americans still restricted to create fund unless they register with the proper regulators? So we have always built on Ethereum until now. We do have it on our roadmap to explore interoperability and other scalable solutions at some point. It's a 3-year roadmap, and I think this is something that will come towards the end of that 3-year roadmap, given how nascent some of these other layer one technologies are. But it's definitely something we will consider, but we're actually, reluctant to do that right now because most of DeFi, it doesn't really make sense for an asset management protocol to move to a different chain, for example, without any assets to manage in that protocol. So we'll be keeping a close eye on the space, but for now, we're not seriously considering to move. We're not considering it at all, actually. Are Americans still restricted? Yeah, that's something I can't really give advice on. That's something that I would recommend that other, individuals get advice on. We can help guide you towards law firms that can give advice on that, etc. But I think it really depends on how you set up, what you plan to trade in the fund, and where you're based, where your investors are based, etc. So there's a lot of, it's hard to answer that question generally. And I think it really is a case by case situation, but we're happy to discuss that with you offline or introduce you to law firms that we work closely with.
So I actually have a question. You mentioned this was your team's first time working with the senior user experience designer. I'm curious if you had any very interesting learnings from that experience, like about the project or like any takeaways that'd be interesting for people in this space.
Um, yeah, I mean, I guess I I guess I learned something. I mean, I guess I've always been one for kind of get. I think I've been one of the people, to be honest, who's kind of always pushed for let's get the contracts right first, and then the user experience and the UX UI is kind of easy. It's easy if the contracts work. But I think that I probably underestimated the role of an experienced an experienced UX UI designer who has an eye for these things and also does the process properly from start to finish. And I'm not sure I wish we had hired one earlier, but I think we probably hired one at exactly the right time because, to be honest, our contracts, I think there was only so much we could have done with the UX UI around V1, but I think now is really the perfect time. I think, when you're managing kind of protocol or startup with limited resources, you have to be very careful how you spend. And I think that our ethos has always been, let's get the underlying infrastructure right first, and then we can kind of add the UX UI stuff later. And I don't think I would change that necessarily, but I think it's quite fun now that we are at a stage where we can also invest in the UX UI with someone experienced, because none of us are. And when we tried to make improvements, I'm not sure how successful we were in the past.
Cool. That sounds great. I think there was one last question.
Yeah, I think it just disappeared.
Oh,
Or did it? No, hang on. Oh, yeah. If there's time for interoperability, which chains are being considered? How long would you consider critical to change from? I'm
I
not
think
sure.
you answered that already.
Yeah, I think I
I
am.
think I think you said it was gonna give a 3-year roadmap. It's not on the plan
Yeah,
right now because
yeah,
everything is in Ethereum. All right.
exactly. Yeah.
Yeah, and it makes sense. All right. So, do you have any final thoughts, closing thoughts, before we transition to the next talk?
No, I think that's pretty much it. Thanks for your time. Thanks for having us again. Sinju, it's always a pleasure to be here.
Yeah, thank you for taking the time. We're gonna transition now.